Japan's royal family is often forgotten about in the West. I wouldn't be surprised if a few of you watching didn't know that Japan actually still has an emperor, but indeed they do. It's this man, Emperor Naruhito. Naruhito ascended to the throne in May of 2019 after his father, Emperor Akihito, was abdicated from the throne. These men are the official heads of state of the third most influential economy in the world, and while their powers are almost entirely ceremonial, their living standards are anything but. The immediate royal family has over 1,000 staff working for them directly. This roster includes basic essentials, like, gardeners, chefs, plumbers, chauffeurs, secretaries, security personnel, not to mention 47 servants per royal. But this enormous staff also extends to things like wardrobe managers, royal farmers that farm the family's food, 4 doctors constantly on standby, a silkworm breeder to make sure that the family is always decked out in the finest threads, Shinto advisors, and 30 archaeologists tasked specifically to look after the tombs of the family. Beyond just the manpower, the Japanese royal family claims some pretty pricey real estate. If you think the White House or Buckingham Palace are ritzy, they have nothing on the Japanese royal palace in Tokyo. Sprawled out over 379 acres in the heart of the largest city in the world, this royal residence was once more valuable than all the real estate in California combined. Nowadays, it's worth about as much as 2.5 San Francisco townhouses, but that's a whole other issue. This estate, along with dozens of other lavish estates dotted around the country, cost a lot to maintain. And that's why the government of Japan gives the family 11.83 billion yen, or around 110 million American dollars, every year to keep everything up to the royal standard. This is on top of a personal expense account of 324 million yen, or 2.9 million US dollars for every member of the direct royal family, as well as 269 million yen for every member of the extended family. This is taxpayers' money, which is all going to fund the ridiculously lavish lifestyle of a huge family that hasn't actually played an active role in managing the country since World War II. And even back then, their job performance wasn't what I would call stellar. So, it's time to learn how money works to make sense of how this family justifies their unbelievable operating expenses in a country that has not seen sustained economic growth in nearly 3 decades. This video was made possible by all of my amazing YouTube channel members and supporters on Patreon. For early access to videos and an extra exclusive video every month, please consider helping the channel out on either of these platforms. Now, so far, the Japanese royal family might sound very similar to the British royal family, and indeed, there are a lot of similarities. For starters, they both swallow up a lot of taxpayer money to fund their lifestyles, with the British royal family costing the equivalent of $93 million in 2019, and the Japanese royal family costing approximately double that. What's more is that they both have a huge amount of staff working for them. They are both almost entirely ceremonial, they both directly receive public funding, and curiously enough, they are both the head of 2 respective religions. The Church of England is ruled over by the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Shintoism is headed up by the Emperor of Japan. A side note here is that Shintoism is not necessarily a religion, in the same way that most people in the West might think of it. It's more of a shared belief system, more so than a defined set of teachings, and as such, lacks the rigid hierarchies that you tend to see in Western religions. Despite this, everybody that practices Shintoism just agrees that this guy is the top dog. The royal family is incredibly ingrained into the wider Japanese culture. This one family has ruled over the country for the last 1600 years, with some records indicating that this monarchy could stretch back as far as 600 BC. The family is pretty much biblical, and emperors up until the Second World War were seen as gods on Earth. Now, I don't want to turn this into how culture works, but the reason that I bring this up is that most Japanese people really don't have a problem paying for this family to live the way that they do. They are a cultural icon that represents the history of Japan. In theory, this family acts as a unifying entity that is above party politics. They are the equivalent of the Washington Monument in America or the Opera House in Australia, just in human form. These national landmarks just naturally require some upkeep. We wouldn't be making a video talking about the maintenance costs of the Statue of Liberty, because nobody really has a problem with that. This family's job is pretty much exactly the same, and they need money to safely and effectively play their role for the Japanese people. Now, if you are still thinking that this sounds like a pretty expensive national landmark, you're not wrong, but it actually could have been a whole lot worse. After the end of World War II, there were talks of ending the Japanese monarchy altogether. The then Emperor Naruhito was at the time anything but ceremonial. He played an active role in the conflict similar to all of the other wartime leaders. But he was never tried for any of his crimes, and you better believe there were plenty of crimes to be tried for. In fact, he got to continue to live in complete luxury up until his death 44 years later in 1989. Why? Well, a few reasons. The first being communism. The Allied powers were afraid of the Japanese taking a peace deal with the Soviets, which would give them unwelcome influence over the region. To deal with this, the Americans offered them a pretty sweet deal where they promised not to do anything rude like, make them pay for their atrocities. This also meant that the Allies didn't have to plan for a land war on the Japanese mainland, which most historians agree would have been absolutely devastating for both sides. One compromise was that the emperor could keep on being emperor, but he could in no way wield the same power that he did before and during the war. The country was to be run by an elected parliament, with the head of state power effectively residing with the new prime minister. For better or worse, this allowed America to form very strong ties with the newly reinvented Japan, and still to this day, the country continues to host many large American foreign military bases. Another compromise was that the sprawling royal family tree was to be trimmed down a bit so as to move the country away from a system of nobility. There were 12 distinct royal lines before World War II, but after the war, only Naruhito, his siblings, and their respective children were recognized as royals. The cousins and uncles were all downgraded to commoners. Ouch. This means that when funding was set up to maintain the dynasty as agreed upon, it only had to fund a dozen royals rather than hundreds. So, with the history lesson out of the way, let's look at what the fund did. Before the war, the Japanese emperor basically owned all of the royal land and artifacts in the country. It was his personal property, the same as you might own your own home. After the war, this was yoinked off of him as part of the efforts to democratize the nation and ceremonialize the emperor's actual power. A lot of this land was just given back to the government, who used it for parks, farmland, and tourist attractions. What was left over was again split up. Some items the emperor was allowed to keep as his own personal property. We are talking about personal artifacts like clothes, nothing worth too much in the grand scheme of things, especially when compared to the wealth of the emperor previously. The most valuable assets, like the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, were given to a government organization called the Imperial Household Agency. This agency was put in charge of managing the affairs of the royals and making sure that they were both able to fulfill their royal duties while also ensuring that they followed the rules. Now, these rules are incredibly detailed, but the royals have to abide by them or else they risk being cut off from their access to their generous government allowances, palaces, and personnel. To give you an idea of these restrictions, the royal family is not allowed to vote. They are not allowed to have a job in anything other than a not-for-profit institution. They are not allowed to marry commoners, and they are also not allowed to give or receive gifts totaling more than $15,000 per year without special permission and approval by Japanese federal parliament. Now, you might think $15,000 sounds pretty generous, and yeah, sure, you or I might be happy to receive that much. But for world leaders, it's very restrictive. If a royal father wanted to gift his son a new Toyota Camry from his royal allowance, well, he would basically have to have that request passed into law. Add on to this the fact that they are required to meet constantly with all manner of high-profile people, and you can see how this limit can be reached very quickly. Also, looking at their multi-million-dollar per year allowances might give you the wrong impression of their personal wealth. They are not allowed to funnel this money into their own personal bank accounts. They can use this money to buy effectively whatever they want, so long as it's legal, but it doesn't go towards their own personal assets. In 2001, then Emperor Akihito spent $200,000 on a $4,500 bottle wine cellar, which is obviously very lavish. But this wine didn't personally belong to him. He was allowed to drink it and serve it to his guests as he saw fit, but it was still the property of the Imperial Household Agency, and by extension, the Japanese government, and by extension, the Japanese people. So why all of these tight controls? Well, two reasons. The first, and most widely acknowledged, is that the government doesn't want the royals getting personally wealthy off of taxpayer money. You might look at this family and assume that they are massively wealthy, but that's not really the case. It's sort of like looking at the president getting off Air Force One and assuming that they have jumbo private jet money. I mean, some of them do, but these opulent symbols of wealth belong to the state and are just made available to the president for them to fulfill their duties. Of course, the Japanese emperor differs from the American president in the sense that they were never voted into office, and they can stay emperor for as long as they live and then pass that office down to their children. But besides that little detail, the same relationship exists between the president and the White House as does between the Japanese emperor and the Imperial Palace. Now, that's not to say that they haven't become wealthy. The thing about having all of your needs taken care of you by the state for 80 years is that it gives an even modest amount of money time to grow unimpeded by pesky things like living expenses. The royal princes and princesses are not allowed to work in the private sector, but any salaries they draw from their non-profit jobs or any money owned by their partners when they get married just gets put into a pot and never touched. This slow and steady growth has given the current emperor a private net worth of around $40 million. Not bad at all, but it's not private equestrian track in the middle of Tokyo City rich. Which is the second reason that the royals have such tight controls on how they use imperial funds. It keeps them in line. If the royal family was to break the rules of the Imperial Household Agency, they could quite literally be kicked out onto the streets. Sure, they would still be pretty well off, but as such high-profile public figures, they would likely burn through their comparatively modest fortune over time with security costs alone. Holding the family by the purse strings means that this lavish lifestyle is somewhat of a trade-off. Yes, they get to live in luxury, and yes, they have every wish tended to. But they also need to stay in line and be available year-round to further Japan's national interest. Despite the immense trappings of wealth that the family is afforded, I don't know if I would trade places with them. It's literally the epitome of a gilded cage. So this leaves just one question. Is it worth it? We have seen that the royal family has basically made themselves a well-looked-after public asset, but does this asset justify its costs? An argument could be made that the British royal family justifies its cost to the taxpayers just through the tourism that is drawn to the country by the star power of the royal family. But that's not really true for the Japanese royal family. As I said at the beginning of the video, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you didn't even know that Japan still had an emperor. Now, for argument's sake, let's just ignore the fact that the new government established in Japan after World War II promised to maintain the monarchy. Yeah, sure, a promise is a promise, but I'm going to blow your minds and let you know that some governments have been known to lie. But the thing is, there is a good chance most of this money would have been spent anyway, with the emperor or without him. Japan relies heavily on what is known as soft power when dealing with other nations. That means they want to work hard to stay in the good graces of potential trade partners and military allies. The Japanese royal family are essentially just regal ambassadors for the country. Talking to a Japanese diplomat is great and all, but talking to the actual Emperor of Japan about continued friendship between nations holds a lot more weight. If the Japanese royal family was to be dissolved tomorrow, it's not like the government wouldn't need to maintain the imperial palaces spread out over the country. They would still need to pay diplomats to speak on behalf of the state, and they would still need to fund big fancy state dinners. The princes, princesses, empresses, and emperors are just very traditional ways of performing modern diplomacy. Are they a little bit spoiled? Yeah, probably. Could the same thing be achieved at a lower cost to the taxpayer? Oh yeah, most definitely. But Japan is a democratic monarchy, and a large majority of the voters in the nation want to maintain their emperor. So who are we to do a cost-benefit analysis? But what do you think? Do you think monarchies have a place in our modern world? If you don't, maybe you should go and learn about the hidden American monarchies by watching my video on the real reasons why family fortunes like the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts actually disappeared after being passed down through generations. I want to again thank my channel members and patrons on Patreon for making it possible for everybody to keep on learning how money works.